The King of Elfland's Daughter by Lord Dunsay. Part 14. Chapter 28. A chapter on unicorn hunting. None in Earl was so busy but that he came that morning to see the magic that was newly come out of Elfland, and to compare the trolls with all that the neighbours said of them. And the folk of Earl gazed much at the trolls, and the trolls at the folk of Earl, and there was a great merriment, for, as often happens with minds of unequal weight, each laughed at each other. And the villagers found the impudent ways of the bare, brown, nimble trolls no funnier, no more meet for derision, than the trolls found the grave high hats, the curious clothes, and the solemn air of the villagers. And Orion soon came too, and the folk of the village doffed their long, thin hats. And though the trolls would have laughed at him also, Luraloo had found his whip, and by means of it made the mob of his impudent brethren give that salutation that is given in Elfland to those of its royal line. When noonday came, which was the hour of dinner, and the folk turned from the kennels, they went back to their houses, all praising the magic that was come at last to Earl. During the days that followed, Orion's hounds learned that it was in vain to chase a troll and unwise to snarl at one, for, apart from their elvish speed, the trolls were able to leap into the air far over the heads of the hounds, and when each had been given a whip they could repay snarling with an aim that none on earth was able to equal, except those whose sires had carried a whip with hounds for generations. And one morning Orion came to the pigeon loft and called to Luraloo early, and he brought out the trolls, and they went to the kennels, and Orion opened the doors, and he led them all away eastward over the downs. The hounds moved all together, and the trolls with their whips ran beside them like a flock of sheep surrounded by a number of collies. They were away to the border of Elfland to wait for the unicorns, where they came through the twilight to eat the earthly grasses at evening. And as our evening began to mellow the fields we know, they were come to the opal border that shut those fields from Elfland. And there they lurked at earth's darkness grew, and waited for the great unicorns. Each hound has its troll beside it, with the troll's right hand along its shoulder or neck, soothing it, calming it, and holding it still, while the left hand held the whip. The strange group lingered there motionless, and darkened there with the evening. And when earth was as dim and as quiet as the unicorns desired, the great creatures came softly through, and were far into earth before any troll would allow his hound to move. Thus, when Orion gave the signal, they easily cut one off from its elfin home, and hunted it, snorting over these fields that are the portion of men. And night came down on the proud beast's magic gallop, and the hounds intoxicate with the marvellous scent, and the leaping, soaring trolls. And when jackdaws on the highest towers of Earl saw the rim of the sun all red above the frosted fields, Orion came back from the downs with his hounds and his trolls, carrying as fine a head as a unicorn hunter could wish. The hounds, weary but glad, were soon curled up in their kennels, and Orion in his bed, while the trolls in their pigeon loft began to feel, as none but Luraloo had felt before, the weight and the weariness of the passing of time. All day Orion slept, and all his hounds, none of them caring how it slept or why, while the trolls slept anxiously, falling asleep as fast as ever they could, in the hope of escaping some of the fury of time, which they feared had begun to attack them. And that evening, while still they slept, hounds, trolls, and Orion there met again in the forge of Gnarl, the Parliament of Earl. From the forge to the inner room came the 12 old men, rubbing their hands and smiling, ruddy with health and keen north wind, and the cheerfulness of their forebodings, for they were well content at last that their lord was surely magic, and foresaw great doings in Earl. "Folklings," said Niall to them all, naming them thus after an ancient wont, "it is not well with us in our valley at last. See how as it is we planned so long ago, for our lord is a magic lord as we all desired, and magical things have sought him from over there, and they all obey his hests." "It is so," said all but Gazik, a vendor of beeves. Little and old and out of the way was Earl, secluded in its deep valley, unnoticed in history, and the 12 men loved the place and would have it famous. And now they rejoiced as they heard the words of Niall. "What other village," he said, "has traffic with over there?" And Gazik, though he rejoiced with the rest, rose up in a pause of their gladness. "Many strange things," he said, "have entered our village coming from over there, and it may be that human folk are best, and the ways of the field we know." Oth scorned him, and Threll, "Magic is best," said all. And Gazik went silent again and raised his voice no more against the many, and the mead went round, and all spoke of the fame of Earl, and Gazik forgot his mood and the fear that was in it. Far into the night they rejoiced, quaffing the mead, and by its homely aid gazing into the years of the future, so far as they may be done by the eyes of men. Yet all their rejoicing was hushed and their voices low, lest the ears of the freer should hear them. For their gladness came to them from lands that lay beyond thought of salvation, and they had set their trust in magic, against which, as well they knew, boomed every note that rang from the bell of the freer whenever it tolled in the evening. And they parted late, praising magic in no loud tones, and went secretly back to their houses, for they feared the curse that the freer had called down upon unicorns, and knew not if their own names might become involved in one of the curses called upon magical things. All the next day, Orion rested his hounds, and the trolls and the people of Earl gazed at each other. But on the day that followed, Orion took his sword and gathered his band of trolls and his pack of hounds, and all were away once more over the downs to come again to the border of nebulous opals and to lurk for the unicorns coming through in the evening. They came to a part of the border far from the spot where they had disturbed only 3 evenings before, and Orion was guided by the chattering trolls, for well they knew the haunts of the lonely unicorns, and Earth's evening came huge and hushed, till all was dim as the twilight, and never a footfall did they hear of the unicorns, never a glimpse of their whiteness. And yet the trolls had guided Orion well, for just as he would have despaired of a hunt that night, just when the evening seemed wholly and utterly empty, a unicorn stood on the earthward edge of the twilight, where nothing had stood only a moment before. Soon he moved slowly across the terrestrial grasses a few yards forward into the fields of men. Another followed, moving a few yards also, and then they all stood for 15 of our earthly minutes, moving nothing at all except their ears. And all that while the trolls hushed every hound, motionless under a hedge of the fields we know. Darkness had all but hidden them when they at last the unicorns moved, and as soon as the largest was far enough from the frontier, the trolls let loose every hound and ran with them after the unicorns, with shrill yells of derision, all sure of his haughty head. But the quick small minds of the trolls, though they had learned much of the earth, had not yet understood the irregularity of the moon. Darkness was new to them, and they all soon lost hounds. Orion, in his eagerness to hunt, had made no choice of a suitable night. There was no moon at all, and would be none till morning. Soon he also fell behind. Orion easily collected the trolls. The night was full of their frivolous noises, and the trolls came back to his horn, but not a hound would leave that pungent magical scent for any horn of man. They straggled back the next day, tired, having lost their unicorn. And while each troll cleaned and fed his hound on the evening after the hunt and laid a little bunch of straw for it on which to lie down, and smoothed its hair and looked for thorns in its feet and unravelled burrs from its ears, Luraloo sat alone, fastening his small, sharp intelligence, like the little white light of a burning glass, for hours upon one question. This question that Luraloo pondered far from the night was how to hunt unicorns with dogs in the darkness, and by midnight a plan was clear in his elvish mind. Chapter 29. The Luring of the People of the Marshes. As the evening that followed was beginning to fade, a traveller might have been seen approaching the marshes, which some way south-eastward of Earl lay along the edge of the farmsteads and stretched their terrible waste as far as the skyline, and even over the border and into the region of Elfland. They glimmered now as the light was leaving the land. So black were the solemn clothes and the high grave hat of the traveller that he could have been seen from far against the dim green of the fields, going down to the edge of the marsh through the grey evening, but none were there to see at such an hour because that desolate place, for the threat of darkness was already felt in the fields, and the cows were all home, and the farmers warm in their houses, so the traveller walked alone. And soon he was come by unsure paths to the reeds and the thin rushes, to which a wind was telling tales that have no meaning to man. Long histories of bleakness and ancient legends of rain, while on the high darkening land, far off behind him, he saw lights begin to blink where the houses were. He walked with the gravity and the solemn air of a man who has important business with men, yet his back was turned to their houses, and he went where no man wandered, travelling towards no hamlet or lonely cottage of man, for the marsh ran right into Elfland. Between him and the nebulous border that divides earth from Elfland, there was no man whatever, and yet the traveller walked on as one that had a grave errand. With every venerable step that he took, bright mosses shook, and marsh seemed about to engulf him, while his worthy staff sank deep into slime, giving him no support, and yet the traveller seemed only to care for the solemnity of his pacing. Thus he went on, over the deadly marsh, with a deportment suitable to the slow procession where the elders open in the market on special days, and the gravest blesses the bargaining. And all the farmers came to the booths and barter, and up and down, songbirds went wavering home, skirting the marsh's edge on their way to their native hedges. Pigeons passed landward to roost in high dark trees. The last of a multitude of rooks was gone, and all the air was empty. And now the great marsh thrilled to the news of the coming of a stranger. For no sooner had the traveller gravely set a foot on one of those brilliant mosses that bloom in the pools, than a thrill shot under their roots and below the stems of the bulrushes, and ran like light beneath the surface of the water, or like the sound of a song, and passed far over the marshes, and came quivering to the border of magical twilight that divides Elfland from earth, and stayed not there, but troubled the very border and passed beyond it, and was felt in Elfland. For where the great marshes run down to the borders of earth, the frontier is thinner and more uncertain than elsewhere. And as soon as they felt that thrill in the deep of the marshes, the will-o'-the-wisps soared up from their fathomless homes, and waved their lights to beckon the traveller on over the quaking mosses at the hour where the ducks were fighting. And under that whir and rush and rejoicing of wings that the ducks made in that hour, the traveller followed after the wavering lights, further and further into the marshes. Yet sometimes he turned from them, so that for a while they followed him instead of leading as they were accustomed to do, till they could get round in front of him and lead once more. A watcher, if there had been one in such a bad light and in such a perilous place, had noticed after a while in the venerable traveller's movements a queer resemblance to those of the hen-green plover, where she lures the stranger after her in spring, away from the mossy bank where her eggs lie bare. Or perhaps such a resemblance is mere fanciful, and a watcher might have noticed no such thing. At any rate, on that night, in the desolate place, there was no watcher whatsoever. And the traveller followed his curious course, sometimes towards the dangerous mosses, sometimes towards the safe green land, always with a grave demeanour and a reverent gait, and the will-o'-the-wisps in multitudes gathered about him. And still the deep thrill that warned the marsh of a stranger throbbed on through the ooze below the roots of the rushes, and did not cease as it should as soon as the stranger was dead, but haunted the marsh like some echo of music that magic has made everlasting, and troubled the will-o'-the-wisps even over the border in Elfland. Now, it is far from my intention to write anything detrimental to will-o'-the-wisps, or anything that may be construed as being slightly upon them. No such construction should be put upon my writings, but it is well known that the people of the marshes lure travellers to their doom, and have delighted to follow that avocation for centuries, and I may be permitted to mention that this is no spirit of disapproval. The will-o'-the-wisps, then, that were about this traveller, redoubled their efforts with fury, and when still he eluded their last enticements only on the very edge of the deadliest pools, and still lived and still travelled, and the whole marsh knew of it, then the greater will-o'-the-wisps that dwell in Elfland rose up from their magical mire and rushed over the border, and the whole marsh was troubled. Almost like little moons grown nimbly impudent, the people of the marshes glowed before the solemn traveller, leading his reverend steps to the edge of death, only to retrace their steps again to beckon him back once more. And then, in spite of the great height of his hat and the dark length of his coat, that frivolous people began to perceive that mosses were bearing his weight, which had never before had supported any traveller. And this their fury increased, and they all leaped nearer to him, and nearer they flocked wherever he went, and in their fury their enticements were losing their craftiness. And now a watcher in the marshes, if such there had been, had seen something more than a traveller surrounded by will-o'-the-wisps, for he might have noticed that the traveller was almost leading them, instead of the will-o'-the-wisps leading the traveller, and in their impatience to have him dead, the people of the marshes had never thought that they were all coming nearer and nearer the dry land. And when all was dark but the water, they suddenly found themselves in a field of grass, with their feet rasping against the rough pasture, while the traveller was seated with his knees gathered up to his chin, and was eyeing them from under the brim of his high black hat. Never before had any of them been lured to dry land by traveller, and there were amongst them that night those eldest and greatest among them, who had come with their moonlight lights right over the border from Elfland. They looked at each other in uneasy astonishment as they dropped limply onto the grass, for the roughness and the heaviness of the solid land oppressed them after the marshes. And then they began to perceive that vulnerable traveller, whose bright eyes watched them so keenly out of the black mass of clothes, was a little larger than they were themselves, in spite of his reverend airs. Indeed, though stouter and rounder, he was not quite so tall. Who was this, they began to mutter, who had lured will-o'-the-wisps? And some of these elders from Elfland went up to him that they might ask him with what audacity he had dared to lure such as them. And the traveller spoke, without rising or turning his head. He spoke where he sat. "People of the marshes," he said, "do you love unicorns?" And at the word unicorns, scorn and laughter filled every tiny heart in all that frivolous multitude, excluding all other emotions, so that they forgot their petulance at having been lured, although the lure will-o'-the-wisp is held by them to be the gravest of insults. and never would they have forgiven it if they had longer memories. At the word unicorns, they all giggled in silence, and this they did by flickering up and down like the light of a little mirror flashed by an impudent hand. Unicorns? Little love had they for haughty creatures. Let them learn to speak to their people of the marshlands when they came to drink at their pools. Let them learn to give their due to the great lights of Elfland and the lesser lights that illumined the marshes of earth. No, said an elder of the Will-o'-the-Wisp, none loves the proud unicorns. Come then, said the traveller, and we will hunt them, and you shall light us in the night with your lights, when we hunt them with dogs over the fields of men. Venerable traveller, said the elder Will-o'-the-Wisp, but at these words the traveller flung up his hat and leapt from his long black coat and stood before the Will-o'-the-Wisps, stark naked, and the people of the marshes saw that it was a troll that had tricked them. Their anger at this was slight, for the people of the marshes have tricked the trolls, and the trolls have tricked the people of the marshes, each of them so many times for ages and ages that only the wisest amongst them can say which has tricked the other most, and this is how many tricks ahead. They consoled themselves now by thinking of times when Troll had been made to look ludicrous and consented to come with their lights to help hunt unicorns, for their wills were weak when they stood on the dry land, and they easily acquiesced in any suggestion to follow anyone's whim. It was Luraloo who had thus tricked the Will-o'-the-Wisps, knowing well how they loved to lure travellers, and, having obtained the highest hat and the gravest coat he could steal, he had set out with a bait that he knew would bring them all from a great distance. Now that he had gathered them all on the solid land and had their promise of light and help against the unicorns, with such creatures will give easily on account of the unicorn's pride, he began to lead them away to the village of Earl, slowly at first while their feet grew accustomed to the hard land, and over the fields he brought them, limping to Earl. And now there was nothing in all the marshes that at all resembled man, and the geese came down on a huge tumult of wings. The little swift teal shot home, and all the dark air twanged with the flight of the duck. End of part 14. If you have been enjoying this audiobook, please take the time to subscribe. It would really help the station. If you could also like or leave a comment or share this station with other friends, that would be great. Thank you.